Now let's look at a few specific cases of price ceilings and price floors that we've seen in our economy. The first specific case is one of rent control. Some cities have what they call rent control. Now this is something that, as far as I know, is becoming less common over time, as economists have really pointed out just how bad this policy can be. But really all it is that there's a maximum legal rent. Sometimes this is tied to square footage or something like that, where an apartment of a certain size can only have a rent of a certain level or less. Now, so what kind of effects would we expect from this maximum legal rent? Well, naturally, as a price control, it's going to have price control kinds of effects. So, it's a maximum legal rent, that makes it a price ceiling. As a price ceiling, we know that it's certainly going to be bad for the landlords, being the producers and providers of rental housing, and at the same time it will tend to have a mixed effect on the tenants. Some tenants finding it very difficult to find housing and being made worse off, others that manage still to find housing and can do it more cheaply, those would generally tend to be made better off. So the direct effect we would expect to be housing shortages. You force down the price of housing, more people are going to want to go out and live on their own, say, while at exactly the same time, it doesn't make sense for the providers of housing to do so. The price is pushed down, so it's not nearly as profitable as it would otherwise have been. At the same time, there are lots of indirect effects. For example, one we call rekeying fees. This is a case where when you move into this new apartment, your landlord charges you a non-refundable rekeying fee. The idea being that they have to change all of the locks. Right? So this rekeying fee very well may run into the hundreds or perhaps even thousands of dollars. Now, everything sounded sensible to that point. Right, okay, having to change the locks, this is an expense, alright, sure, they're charging me for it, whatever, that's fine. But once we start getting into the thousands of dollars, it becomes obvious that this isn't actually a fee for changing locks. Instead, what it is that technically they're not allowed to charge a certain level of rent that would be more appropriate in the market. So they're taking some of that rent, they're packaging it as a fee, and calling it something else. This is really just a way of the market trying to get around this price control by calling the price something else, dodging the law. Finder's fees have a very similar effect. With finder's fees, because there's a housing shortage, that creates then a market for people to really just specialize in finding housing for people to live in. So here we have, and these people may do so for a fee. So I will help you find a house, but you're going to have to pay me a certain amount of money to do so. Right? So this is another case where finder's fees, it's really, in a sense, search costs being made explicit. Somebody else is doing the searching for you, so you're having to pay them to do it. Another thing we see is poor quality, where suppose that I have a particular apartment that I'm the landlord of, and say that I think a fair price for this apartment would be $1,000 a month. But by law, I'm only allowed to charge $700. Well, in that case, I have every reason to go ahead and let the value, that is, the true quality of this apartment, deteriorate until $700 a month is actually a pretty fair price. So I'm not going to bother, say, freshening up the paint on a regular basis between tenants. I'm not going to bother making sure the carpet is reasonably new. I'm certainly not going to put in any new features for this apartment because it's not going to be profitable for me to do so. So I'll just allow for the quality to deteriorate. At times, this can become extremely severe. Walter Block wrote a book about rent control, and apparently at the beginning of every chapter he says he had a picture. And the picture was either of rent-controlled housing, I believe from the Bronx or one of the boroughs of New York City, and some of the other pictures were from Dresden after it was bombed. And he said it was remarkably difficult to tell which was which. That is, the effect of rent control on housing quality is more or less the same as being bombed. It has this huge impact that's certainly not a good thing for the tenants. Now, because of these negative effects, it might be that the legislators decide they're going to change the law. So here we recognize there are these housing shortages. That's not a good thing. So let's make a new law where only older buildings are rent control. Right, so if you build a new building, you don't have any rent control on it. Well, the problem with this fix to the rent control law is that it creates an obvious incentive. If I have a nice old building in a nice location, I'm not going to leave it. I will tear it down and build a new building in its place. Right? After all, being able to increase my rent very well may be able to pay for the entire new building. Now, this is obviously a bad use of our resources. if you're going to tear down a building, we want to make sure that it's not high quality, but that it's low quality. But we have exactly the opposite incentive here with this type of rent control law. Now, okay, we don't want to have people tearing down old buildings to build new ones, so what's something else we could do? Now, another option would be something we might call a rent freeze. This is a case where when you move in, your landlord says, here's what the rent will be, and that is what the rent will be as long as you stay in that same place. Now, if you move, then the landlord is perfectly free to change the rent for the next person that's coming in. Right? So the rent is not tied to the location, but is tied to the person that's in that location as long as they stay there. Now here that creates an obvious incentive for what we call the old lady effect. The old lady effect is this effect where we can imagine a family moving into this nice 3-4 bedroom apartment in New York City in 1970, and as time passes, 40-45 years pass from there, the husband dies, the kids move out and start families of their own, and eventually we end up with this widow, this little old lady, living in this 3 or 4 bedroom apartment, paying rent from 1970. Now, sensibly, it would make sense for her in this situation to move to a smaller place, except that it ends up that rent for a smaller place in 2013 is significantly higher than 1970 rent for her 3 or 4 bedroom apartment. So she has every reason to cling to this very large, not necessarily even manageable apartment, despite the fact that she has very little use for it and would probably be better off in a smaller place. Now, there's the flip side of that, and that is that the landlord has every reason to discourage people from being long-term tenants. So while the old lady is trying to cling to this apartment, their landlord is trying to drive them out so they can actually finally increase the rent after 45 years. Right, so that creates this horrible relationship between the landlord and the tenant that gives a lot more conflict than there would necessarily have to be. Where we'd think normally moving is a pain, finding new tenants is a pain. So we would expect the landlord and the tenant to try to work out any problems the two might have. But in the case of rent control, that's no longer the case. Now, there are a couple cases where the government has actually put in place broad price controls for various reasons. One of those cases was during the Great Depression in the United States. Here, the theory was that low prices were depressing the economy. More or less, the idea was prices are really, really low right now because nobody's making any money, but because prices are low, nobody's earning any profit. Since nobody's earning any profit, we're not hiring anybody, so unemployment is high. So what we really need to do to get things kick-started is force prices up. Right, so the government comes along and forces prices up through various acts of various kinds, but really just encouraging businesses to push prices up beyond where they were before. Now, the result of this was that we had an excess supply. You drive prices up, right, it ends up people still can't afford the thing, and the higher you drive prices up, the less people can afford. So we're trying to produce more because we think the price is higher, but at the same time nobody wants to buy it. Now, since nobody wants to buy it, eventually businesses get wise to this and lay off more people. Right. So it ends up that this, in all likelihood, had an effect of making the Depression last all the longer and be all the worse, precisely because prices were forced up through these various acts. Now, following the Great Depression, there was World War II, which was another case where there were broad price controls. In this case, the government didn't want prices to rise because a lot of the economy was really going to serve the government at that time. Is something like, I believe, 40% of the economy, 45% of the economy was really just providing goods for the war effort. So naturally, the government doesn't want prices to go up because that'd make the war all the more expensive. They want to keep prices down, so they just legislate you're not allowed to raise prices. As a result, there are massive shortages. You force prices down, people really want to buy things, while at the same time, not as much is being provided. Now here we add to it that because of the war effort, it was very easy for people to find jobs. It ends up it's relatively easy to find jobs for 10 million people when you draft 12 million. Right, so it was very easy for people to find work. People had lots of income, far higher than it was during the Great Depression, but they couldn't find anything to spend it on. Right. As a result of these massive shortages, we actually had rationing that happened. So rather than allowing prices to rise until there was some kind of balance between the available supply and the demand for the goods, goods were rationed. So for me to, for example, buy milk from the store, it wasn't enough for me to just have the money to buy the milk. I also had to bring with me a ration coupon that was issued by the government stating that I had the right legally to buy that milk for my family. So these are cases where we had very broad price controls, and we saw significant impacts from those price controls. Another example of very commonly known price control is the minimum wage. The minimum wage we know is a minimum legal wage that you're allowed to pay an employee. This makes it a price floor for labor. Now the direct impact is exactly what we would expect. You force the price of something up, that means more people want to provide it, fewer want to buy it. Now in the world of the labor market, if lots of people want to provide the thing, here the thing is labor, lots of people are going to look for work. While at the same time, nobody wants to buy labor. In other words, hiring is down. So we end up with unemployment, an excess supply of labor, people that would like to find work but are unable to find it. That's what we call unemployment. Right, so this is where unemployment is a result of the minimum wage. Now, I'm not saying unemployment is only a result of the minimum wage. It can be caused by other things, like the fact that when I get laid off from my job, I don't immediately go and find a new one. It takes some time, as there's the search process that has to happen. So that is a real thing. But we would expect the minimum wage to make unemployment at least somewhat worse. At the very least, it's not going to make it any better. But at the same time, the minimum wage has some significant indirect impacts that are actually pretty interesting. One thing we might see, very much like we have, say, finder's fees or rekeying fees in the world of rent control, here we might have something like uniform rental fees. Probably my favorite example of this is if you go back, it's a very old episode of The Simpsons, it's a Christmas episode, where Homer doesn't get his Christmas bonus this year. And he's very sad because it's not clear how they're going to pay for Christmas without the Christmas bonus. So he goes and he gets a job as a mall Santa. Well, as a mall Santa, he thinks he's going to make a lot of money as a mall Santa, working these extra hours. He's working late every night to help pay for Christmas for his family. But at the end of the term that he spends as Santa, he goes to get paid. And they say, well, here's the top line, but then we have to remove the various taxes, and we also have a Santa training and the Santa uniform, and They take everything out, and he made something like $12 for all of his work during the Christmas season. Right. The point here being, really all this does is effectively lower the wage for these employees. So yes, technically I'm paying you the minimum wage, but then I'm charging you for that uniform that you have to wear. Right. Which really just means that in the end, your wage is lower. Another thing we might see is a reduction in benefits. As we know, you are paid in part as this cash wage, but another part of that is the benefits you receive from your employer. Right, so it's very possible that maybe the effect of the minimum wage is that rather than paying you and, say, providing more money toward your health insurance and the like, the employer just gives you more cash. Right? So you have more cash, but fewer benefits to offset that. So that's certainly a possibility. Another effect of the minimum wage is illegal immigration. I'm not saying it's the only reason illegal immigration happens, but the minimum wage creates a very natural alliance between illegal immigrants and those that would like to hire them. Where normally an employer has to be worried about paying less than the minimum wage because they might be reported, if I hire an illegal immigrant at less than the minimum wage, it's actually, well, in a sense, much safer. Because I know that illegal immigrant isn't going to go and report me because they can't do so without bringing attention to themselves. And at the same time, I don't want to report these illegal immigrants because it's very hard to do so without, at the same time, them revealing that I've been paying them less than the minimum wage. So there's a very natural alliance that is going to happen between the employers for illegal immigrants and illegal immigrants just because of the minimum wage, because both of them are operating, in effect, on two sides of this black market. Each of them is going to try to protect the other. Another effect of the minimum wage is offshoring. That is the process of moving jobs from within the United States to outside the United States. Really, this isn't shocking. If we're pushing up the price of labor, particularly unskilled labor, within the U.S., then it's very likely that people are going to go looking to hire in other areas. Right? So if I'm an employer and I want to hire unskilled labor and location doesn't really matter that much, I'm going to go wherever the unskilled labor is relatively cheap. If the price of unskilled labor has been forced up within a particular country, I'm going to go to other countries where the price hasn't been forced up. So offshoring is another potential effect that comes from the minimum wage.